Early on the morning of March 6, 1963, 34-year-old Carol Thompson leaned toward the kitchen window of her big brick house on Hillcrest Avenue. In Minnesota, winters were long and cold, and Carol knew the snow she saw falling over the backyard wasn't heavy enough to mean that school would be canceled that day. But before Carol turned her attention back to the counter, where she was getting lunches packed for her 4 kids, she closed her eyes and thought about the trip she'd just taken a few months ago to the Minnesota Museum of American Art. The scene outside reminded her of one of the paintings she'd seen there, and a second later, all Carol wanted was to be back at that museum, not just looking at the painting, but also standing next to the man who had taken her there. Absent-mindedly, Carol began twisting the gold wedding band on her left ring finger. It wasn't her husband, Cotton Thompson, who she'd gone to the museum with. It was a man that Cotton had hired to do some work on the Thompson house more than a year ago. Carol and Cotton just called him by his nickname, Big Red. The tall, handsome, and red-haired door and window salesman had taken an immediate and obvious liking to Carol. And even after the work in the Thompson house was done, Big Red and Carol had kept in touch. Carol's husband, Cotton, who was a criminal defense attorney in downtown St. Paul, was so busy with his law practice that sometimes Carol felt forgotten, and so she had enjoyed Big Red's attention and harmless flirting. So, whenever Big Red was working in the Thompsons' upper-class neighborhood, with all the expensive Tudor-style homes with their gabled windows and exposed timber beams, Big Red would make a point to stop by the house to visit Carol. Big Red would go on strolls in the park with her, and even drove her and the 4 Thompson kids out to the family's summer home on Forest Lake, north of St. Paul. But those visits had stopped a few months ago after Cotton had become furious to find them talking and laughing together in the backyard one afternoon when he came home unexpectedly from work. Now, as Carol stood at the window, she looked down at her hands and saw what she was doing with her wedding band, and she gave herself a mental shake. It was true that Carol had been disappointed when Cotton had told Big Red to stay away from her, but as she reminded herself, Big Red had never posed any real threat to her marriage. In fact, Carol had actually been a bit thrilled to see Cotton's show of jealousy, and she had definitely enjoyed the extra attention Cotton had been paying to her ever since that backyard face-off. Besides, everything that Carol had ever really wanted in life was right here, under the roof of the 2.5-story home that Cotton had redecorated just for her, right down to the custom rugs and the color of the brand new appliances. And best of all, Carol finally had the chance to finish her college degree after 13 years at home raising their 4 kids. Turning to the kitchen counter, Carol took a deep breath, then focused her attention on the familiar tasks that made up her morning routine. With military precision, she laid out the peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and fruit for the 3 Thompson girls to take to the local elementary school, and the apple that her 13-year-old son always brought to middle school. Carol had just finished packing the kids' brown bag lunches when she heard the familiar sound of Cotton's footsteps as he came down the stairs. And by the time the farm boy and Navy veteran strolled into the kitchen, Carol was already smiling. And that smile got even wider when her 36-year-old husband didn't stop until he was close enough that Carol could smell his aftershave. As she turned to face Cotton, he gave her a warm kiss on the lips. When Cotton finally stepped away, the connection between husband and wife felt like it was as strong as it had been 14 years ago when Carol had first met Cotton at Macalester College. Carol had been studying Russian literature at the small, prestigious college. Cotton was 2 years ahead of her, and he was finishing his degree in economics. Cotton had an easy charm and could make people laugh, but he also had serious ambition. He wanted to be a respected and financially successful lawyer, and he had the drive to achieve those goals. They married within a year of meeting each other, and by then, Cotton had already decided that this smart, passionate woman who adored books and art was a partner he would love and cherish for the rest of his days. The two wasted no time starting a family. Carol was pregnant just a few months after the wedding. And now, looking at Cotton, Carol thought about how little he had changed. Even though Cotton's hair was still wet from a morning bath, the water hardly even darkened the color. A blonde so white that her husband had been called Cotton ever since he was a boy. Cotton knew that his wife had been annoyed when he had told Big Red that he was no longer welcome at their home. But Cotton was smart enough to know that Carol was an extremely attractive woman, with her dark curly hair and easy smile, and all Big Red's interest in Carol had really done was to remind Cotton not to fall into the trap of taking his wife for granted. Cotton wanted to get home from work in time to watch the kids, so Carol could make it to school that evening. Cotton had a late meeting that day that could delay him, but he promised Carol he'd move it if he had to. He hated when she had to miss a class because of him. And also, there was another reason Cotton didn't want to stay late at work tonight. He was nervous to leave Carol home alone. Just a week earlier, everyone in St. Paul had been totally shocked by the murder of a 15-year-old high school student who had been stabbed and beaten to death. Her schoolmate had confessed to the killing just 3 days later, but the sheer brutality of the crime had put everyone in the Thompsons' neighborhood on edge. As Cotton stepped out the door with their son, he told Carol he'd give her a call sometime this morning to check in and let her know when he'd be able to get home that night. They gave each other a final kiss, and then Carol watched Cotton and Jeff disappear into the falling snow. About an hour later, as Carol was vacuuming the upstairs bedrooms, she heard the telephone ring. As she turned off the vacuum and headed downstairs to answer it, she wished that they had a second phone up in their master bedroom. Picking up the receiver in the kitchen, Carol heard Cotton's upbeat voice at the other end of the line. His secretary had apparently changed his schedule, so he would be home in time for Carol to go to her evening class. By the time Carol was off the phone and heading back upstairs to put the vacuum cleaner away, she decided that with a late night ahead of her, maybe she'd just take a break from cleaning and go back to bed. But once Carol was inside the master bedroom, she heard a sound that she didn't recognize coming from somewhere in the house. She held her breath for a second and just listened intently. Carol suddenly missed their little dog, Shotzi, who was a terribly behaved dachshund, whose bad habits included barking at everything that moved. They had just recently gotten rid of him because he chewed up all their carefully redecorated furniture. As Carol strained her ears to hear the sound again, she couldn't hear anything. The house was totally quiet. But Carol was still very much on edge. So when she heard the sound again a minute later, she leapt out of her bed, walked up to the door, and opened it to see what was going on. And when she did, she saw there was someone standing right there. Carol had no time to think. Adrenaline flooding her body, she started to fight for her life. "10 minutes later, just after 9 a.m., 3 houses east of the Thompson house, the bell rang. Ruth Nelson left her breakfast nook to answer the door. But before she got there, the bell rang again. So Ruth hustled the last few steps and opened the door, expecting to chew out a salesman for being so pushy. But instead, she saw a woman standing there, barefoot and dressed only in a blood-soaked blue bathrobe. Blood was streaming from cuts on her scalp and face. It took Ruth a moment to recognize that this was her neighbor and friend, Carol Thompson. Carol, as she looked at Ruth, she grabbed at her throat, and Ruth noticed there was something metal protruding from it. And then, in a hoarse voice, barely above a whisper, Carol begged Ruth for help. Ruth and her husband quickly helped Carol into their home, and Ruth asked Carol over and over again, "Who did this to you?" And Carol just looked at her friend and forced out a few words. She said, quote, "A man came to my house." And then Carol collapsed on the rug. A police officer and his sergeant were just a few blocks away, sitting in their squad car when they heard the dispatch call at 9:07 a.m. that morning. They arrived at the Nelson home first, where they found the victim, Carol, lying on the floor. Her eyes were open, but she couldn't speak. The doctor who lived across the street had rushed over to help when his wife saw Carol staggering down the street, and the doctor was putting pressure on Carol's most serious wounds. The police officers immediately called for help, and they would discover that the ambulance was actually already on its way. And so just a couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, they loaded Carol into the ambulance, and they sped off with her. Meanwhile, Ruth's adult son, who was close to Cotton's age and had known him for years, volunteered to make the difficult call to Cotton's law office. He walked slowly to the phone, took a deep breath, and then dialed. When he got Cotton on the line, he would tell him that his wife had been in some sort of accident and was now being taken to nearby Anchor Hospital. As the sirens of a half a dozen arriving police cars wailed, the 2 police officers who had responded first to the scene went 3 doors down to the Thompsons' house. The first thing they noticed were fresh footprints in the snow covering the brick walkway that ran from the front door to the sidewalk, prints that could have belonged to a family member or perhaps the assailant. The two policemen could also see that the front storm door was closed, but the inner door was open, indicating that the killer, or someone, had left in a hurry. They walked around the footprints, careful not to disturb them, as they peered inside the home. When they saw a puddle of blood on the entryway floor, they decided to wait for those squad cars to arrive before going any further. Within minutes, Detective George Barkley pulled up at the Thompson house, along with several officers of the St. Paul Police Department, where the 50-year-old detective had served for 25 years. Barkley adjusted his fedora hat as he stepped out of the car. The officers on scene told him they found that front door wide open and the side door to the house was unlocked. Detective Barkley knew that if either door had been left unlocked, then that really meant just about anyone could have entered the house and done this. Detective Barkley drew his gun and then led the officers inside the home, being very mindful that the killer could still be in the house. But after searching every room in the house, they discovered that the house was clear. There was no one else there. Barkley headed back upstairs. The kids' bedrooms were undisturbed, but the master bedroom was totally ransacked. Barkley wondered if this was maybe a robbery gone wrong. Maybe a burglar was surprised to find Carol home, and they attacked her. That would explain the chaos inside the house. But there were some things about the crime scene that didn't fit the robbery theory. They didn't really fit any coherent theory at all. As Barkley walked through the house, he just felt more and more confused by the evidence he was seeing. For some reason, the tub in the bathroom was filled with about 6 inches of lukewarm water. There was no indication that Carol had been bathing at the time of the attack. There were also smears of blood on the sink and floor, along with a 14-inch length of thick rubber hose. Clearly, the detective thought, the robber must have brought the hose, but for what reason, he didn't know. In a pool of blood near the bathroom, investigators also found pieces of black and white plastic, the broken handle to a gun. Detective Barkley tracked signs of a struggle which began upstairs and continued downstairs. Carol's fight for her life appeared to have climaxed somewhere between the front entrance to the house and the kitchen. The kitchen was totally smeared with blood, a drawer had been yanked open, and several knives had been pulled out of a tray. The drawer and the linoleum floor were also spotted red. Barkley's men eventually found a pool of blood in the front entrance, and they also found 3 live bullets on the floor. If the robber had a gun, Barkley thought, why had they stabbed Carol so many times instead of just shooting her? And finally, there was the strange question of what, if anything, had actually been stolen. From what Barkley could tell, the house was trashed, but there were pieces of jewelry and other obviously expensive items laying around. At the front entrance, sitting in a pool of blood, they even found a small woman's ring with a cluster of stones in the shape of a heart. And so if this was a robbery, it had been a very unsuccessful one. As Detective Barkley and his team examined the inside of the house, other officers canvassed the neighborhood. For everyone else on the block, it had been a totally normal Wednesday morning, with people beginning their commutes to work and getting their kids off to school. But when police spoke to all the neighbors, nobody had seen anything out of the ordinary. Carol's next-door neighbor had called Carol at 9 a.m., just about the time that Carol was getting attacked. When Carol didn't answer the phone, the neighbor actually peered into her bedroom window to see if she was home, but the neighbor said she didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Whoever attacked Carol had clearly managed to do it without attracting any attention at all, which was hard to do in such a close-knit neighborhood. That suggested to the police that her assailant was not just a crazed person roaming the streets and breaking into homes at random. Whoever assaulted Carol was clearly smart and efficient enough to get away quickly and quietly. As long as they were free, the public could still be in danger. At 10:30 a.m., so an hour and a half after the attack on Carol, the St. Paul Police Department's crime lab team arrived and began dusting for fingerprints, hoping the assailant left his mark. Neighbors peered out of windows, watching the men in overcoats and galoshes standing in the falling snow, taking notes, and snapping photographs. Police also discovered blood droplets and smears tracing Carol's path to various neighbors' houses as she ran around trying to get help. The criminologist followed Carol's footprints out the side door and around the back of her house to the house immediately to the east, and red smears indicated that Carol had rung the bell and pounded on the door and then gone to the next house over before she stumbled to Ruth's house at the corner. Nearby, at Anchor Hospital, where Carol had been taken by the ambulance, her husband, Cotton, sat in the waiting room sobbing while a team of doctors desperately tried to save Carol's life. When Carol had been brought in, she had no pulse. She lost a lot of blood, mainly from the knife wounds in her neck and scalp, and she had lots of cuts on her arms and hands. Carol had clearly fought back hard. There was a 3-inch blade stuck in Carol's throat. The surgeons had removed it, and they performed a procedure called a tracheotomy, which is when doctors cut a hole directly into a person's throat from the outside to help them breathe. But Carol's heart was barely beating, so the doctors put manual pressure on her heart to try to jumpstart it. Doctors also drilled a hole in Carol's skull to remove any blood that might have pooled inside of her head from all the blows she had taken. But ultimately, Carol's injuries proved to be too severe, and at 12:58 p.m. on March 6, 1963, 4 hours after Carol stumbled down her block looking for help, the doctors pronounced her dead. The violent assault had now become a murder investigation for the St. Paul police, and homicides in this Midwestern city were very rare. St. Paul saw an average of just 6 a year. But one of those murders had just taken place 6 days before Carol's, the beating and stabbing of a 15-year-old schoolgirl only 2 miles from the Thompsons' home. There were some similarities between the two deadly assaults, but Detective Barkley helped put that killer behind bars 3 days before Carol was killed. The schoolgirl killing resolved quickly, but it unsettled the residents of Carol's and Cotton's fashionable Highland Park neighborhood, where there had only been a couple of homicides since the end of World War II, 18 years before, and it put a lot of pressure on Detective Barkley to solve this case fast. At the hospital, Detective Barkley spoke to Carol's grief-stricken husband. Cotton would say that Carol had been in a good mood that morning when he left for work just after 8. He also mentioned calling Carol at 8:30 that morning to tell her he would be able to watch the kids that night so she'd be able to go to school. As a defense attorney, Cotton did understand that the husband would be the number one person of interest at the start of any murder investigation, and he was patient and polite with the barrage of questions from the police. He referred investigators to his secretary, who confirmed that Cotton was indeed at his office at the time of his wife's murder. Cotton would also suggest to Detective Barkley 2 possible theories for this crime. Cotton said that it was possible that one of his former clients might have come to rob him or hurt Carol, but he couldn't think of any actual ex-associates who were disgruntled with him. He offered the police access to his client history, but he said he really didn't think it would lead them to the killer. Then Cotton told the detective his second theory. This one, he said, made much more sense than an angry client. It involved a red-haired window and door salesman that he'd done business with a year earlier. Cotton told detectives that this salesman, named Big Red, developed a clear infatuation with his wife and found every excuse to come to their house to see Carol. Cotton told police that he really didn't like the friendship, quote, that had developed between this man and his wife. Barkley asked Cotton if Carol could have been having an affair with Big Red. Cotton shook his head and said absolutely not. He had seen what was developing between Big Red and his wife, and he had stepped in to put a stop to it before it went any further. Cotton explained that a few months earlier, he had come home unexpectedly in the middle of the afternoon, and he had found Big Red in the backyard talking to his wife, and Cotton had watched them from inside the house, and Big Red had said something that made Carol laugh. Her eyes were sparkling, and then Big Red put a hand on Carol's waist, and at that point, Cotton said he burst out the side door and told Big Red to stay away from his wife and his kids, and they proceeded to get into this big shouting match. Cotton was ready to punch Big Red, but before any fists flew, Big Red ultimately stormed off, and as he left, Big Red vowed that this would not be the last time they saw him. The police would also speak to Carol and Cotton's neighbors on either side of their house to see if they knew anything about this relationship Carol had with Big Red. and the neighbors would say they saw Big Red around, spending time with Carol and the kids, and it just seemed like he was a friend of the family. The neighbors did say, though, that it seemed like Big Red was flirting with Carol, and none could blame him for liking their attractive neighbor. Beneath her horn-rimmed glasses, Carol had this winning smile and quick wit. I mean, she was amazing. And Carol had admitted to her neighbors that she found Big Red very attractive. They both liked art and literature, neither of which held any appeal for Cotton. But Carol swore to whoever she talked to that she and Big Red were just friends. However, whatever the real status of that relationship was, Detective Barkley knew he now had his first good lead. Barkley tracked down Big Red at work that afternoon and drove him to the station. Big Red sat with his head in his hands, sobbing as he answered the detective's questions about his relationship to the Thompson family. He confirmed that he had developed a friendship with Carol after he sold Cotton some windows for their house, and he admitted that after that job was finished, he would swing by to see Carol when he was in the neighborhood. Big Red told police that he had taken Carol to an art museum a couple of times, and once he drove Carol and the kids to their summer home, but he was adamant that he had had nothing to do with Carol's death. He told Barkley that after his backyard altercation with Cotton, he dropped his friendship with Carol altogether. Big Red figured that it would be best for him to stay away. He said he hadn't seen Carol since the dust-up with Cotton, and at 9 a.m. on March 6th, when Carol was attacked, Big Red said he was at a sales conference, which his boss would back up. And so, this case was clearly not going to wrap up as fast as Detective Barkley hoped, and the police department was really starting to feel the heat. News of Carol's murder sent shockwaves through the Highland Park and larger Twin Cities communities. A home invasion in that exclusive neighborhood was unthinkable, and the victim, an all-American housewife and mother of 4, was well known in the community and universally adored. To imagine such a woman meeting such a brutal end shook people to the core, and the killer, whoever they were, was still out there. Nervous housewives peered out of their windows, refusing to answer the door for deliveries or door-to-door salesmen, and husbands began coming home early from work every night. In a town that rarely saw a locked door, chain locks were now flying off the shelves of hardware stores. Sporting goods stores ran out of shotgun shells and pistols and bullets. Public officials demanded results. In response, across the Twin Cities region, police rounded up anyone who could in any way be considered a suspect. Wives turned in abusive husbands, petty thieves and sex offenders were pulled off the street, police hauled in peeping toms, public drunks, and known burglars. They threw homeless men, even the disabled and mentally ill, into squad cars and took them downtown. Anyone that seemed even a little bit different or, quote, suspicious in any way, the police fingerprinted and interrogated. But none seemed connected to the case. As the month of March 1963 ticked away, Detective Barkley was starting to get frustrated. He had no fingerprints and no eyewitnesses. His victim had problems in her marriage, but both her husband and the other man she had gotten close to had very solid alibis. The crime scene looked like a robbery, except nothing had been stolen. The only good evidence he really had was the black and white pieces of plastic laminate that police had found in the entryway of the home and in the upstairs hallway. They were very likely parts of the handle of some kind of gun. Detective Barkley figured if he could just identify the weapon, maybe it could lead him to his killer. So he sent the pieces of plastic off to the FBI for analysis, and then he waited very impatiently for a few weeks, and then finally he got his answer. The plastic pieces were indeed from the grip of a gun. They were from a custom-made pistol grip for a 7.65mm Luger pistol. Detective Barkley felt relief at finally making progress here, and now he was hopeful that this would lead to the break in the case that he so badly needed. And so, on April 5th, 1 month after the murder, Detective Barkley and the St. Paul police chief held a televised press conference. They affixed those customized pieces of the pistol grip onto an identical Luger and displayed images of it in poster-sized photos. Barkley and the police chief blasted these pictures all over the state in hopes that someone would recognize this custom gun and call the police to tell them who it belonged to. In the days following the press conference, Barkley began combing through the numerous tips he had from the public since the murder. And at some point, he found an unnamed source claiming that Cotton had taken out $900,000 in life insurance on his wife across 3 carriers, and some of those policies were apparently written as recently as 2 months before the murder. Barkley looked into this claim, and he soon discovered that Cotton had indeed taken out policies, but with 8 carriers totaling $1.1 million, about $10 million in today's dollars. At this time, the average American was making less than $10,000 a year. Investigators spoke to Carol's parents. Her father, who was a successful heating and plumbing contractor in St. Paul, valued his own estate at about $600,000, which would be about $6 million today. Carol, being an only child, was set to inherit all of that money, meaning if she were to die, the family fortune was set to go to her and Cotton and the kids. Detective Barkley started wondering if this, quote, pillar of the community, aka Cotton, was not really the man he presented himself to be. As his investigators spoke to more people in the Thompson circle of friends, he learned that Cotton was often seen around town with other women. Cotton started to look really suspicious to Barkley. But being a bad husband and buying life insurance was not illegal, and Barkley could find no connection between Cotton and the murder weapon. But before Barkley got too deep into his re-examination of Cotton, his press conference about the Luger totally paid off. On April 9th, he received a call from someone claiming that the Luger was actually his. A traveling salesman from Minneapolis told police that his apartment had been burglarized on February 14th, 3 weeks before Carol's murder, and one of the items he reported stolen was that pistol. He had made the customized hand grip in a shop class at a local community college. Detective Barkley confirmed that the salesman was nowhere near St. Paul the day of Carol's murder, and so could not have been her killer. Finally, this felt to Barkley like a really solid lead backed by evidence, but it presented a whole new set of challenges. Now Barkley had to solve a burglary in another city in the hopes that the perpetrator of that crime was also the one who committed this murder. But it wouldn't take long for the police to catch another break. On April 17th, so 8 days after that salesman called to say that Luger was his, 2 masked men burst into a bar in St. Paul, they drew their guns, and demanded the bartender hand over the cash in his till. Then one of the robbers punched the bartender before taking the money and escaping with his accomplice. A few days later, St. Paul police arrested the 2 men on suspicion of burglary and assault. The tavern robbery was the latest of several robberies they had committed in the area. When police got the thieves into interview rooms in the jail, one of the robbers struck a deal with the county and started talking. He had information the police wanted. He knew all about that special Luger the cops were looking for. He and his buddy were the ones who actually stole it. The robber claimed that he had only had the Luger for a month. He told police that 2 weeks before Carol's murder, he had given the gun to a man that he and his accomplice knew. His name was Norman Mastrian. The cops knew Norman too. He was a former champion boxer whose life had gone totally south, and he'd had lots of scrapes with the law. In fact, he was actually a suspect in another murder, but detectives couldn't find enough evidence to charge him. Detective Barkley thought Norman was certainly capable of killing Carol. But the robber told police that Norman was not the last person he had seen with that Luger. The day before Carol got murdered, the robber watched Norman give it to someone else, a guy named Dick W.C. Anderson. And police did some digging, and they discovered that Dick was a Korean War veteran with a Purple Heart. And to get a Purple Heart, it means you got injured in combat. But Dick also had a drinking problem, and he had been through a bitter divorce, and he was now apparently a petty criminal, but it really didn't seem like he was a murderer. And Dick had absolutely no connections to the Thompsons, so why would he kill Carol? It felt like the more clues Detective Barkley and his team found, the more of a mystery this case became. Detective Barkley had no problem finding Norman Mastrian, the former champion boxer, but Dick Anderson, the last one to have the Luger, was another story. Dick had left town in a hurry after seeing Barkley's press conference about the Luger. Detective Barkley put out an all-points bulletin across the country with a description of Dick. It was a long shot, but on May 19th, it paid off. 1,700 miles from St. Paul, Police in Phoenix, Arizona entered a cheap motel on an unrelated matter, and they recognized the man who was checking out at the time as Dick Anderson. Police immediately extradited Dick back to Minnesota, and after 3 days in jail, Dick Anderson would confess to everything. And suddenly, all the loose ends and confusing, conflicting pieces of evidence made a terrible kind of sense. The story that Dick had to tell was far more shocking than anything Detective Barkley or any of his colleagues had imagined. Here's what really happened on March 6, 1963, the day Carol Thompson was murdered. Before dawn, Dick Anderson slipped into the Thompson house through the unlocked side door while everyone in the house was asleep. Dick moved silently through the kitchen and headed down to the basement where he waited in the dark. Now, what Dick was doing was not his typical line of work. However, he was broke, and the $3,000 that Norman Mastrian had offered him to do what he was going to do was a lot of money, and so he had agreed to do it. So Dick waited in the darkness of a stranger's basement, periodically glancing at the hand-drawn map he had been given of the home's layout. Dick had also fortified his courage with vodka and amphetamines, and so his heart was racing. The sun rose and Dick listened as just a few feet above his head in the kitchen, Carol got her family fed and out the door. About 20 minutes later, Carol answered the telephone. It was Cotton calling from the office, telling her he'd be home in time for Carol to go to class that evening. Meanwhile, in the basement, Dick grasped the 14-inch length of thick rubber tubing Norman had given him. Dick's plan was to slip into the kitchen and strike Carol on the back of the head with this rubber. He thought a clean blow would totally knock her out. Dick could hear Carol's voice, muffled through the floorboards, as she spoke to her husband. Dick carefully headed up the stairs until one of the wooden steps let out a loud squeak. He heard Carol's voice stop cold. Dick froze and waited to hear Carol resume her phone call. He realized that Carol would hear him coming if he continued up the stairs, so he revised his plan. He would wait in the basement until he was sure Carol had left the kitchen. Eventually, Dick would hear Carol vacuuming on the second floor for several minutes, and then right as he was about to go up, he heard the phone ring again. But this time, Carol did not come downstairs to answer it. She stayed upstairs and let it ring. And so at this point, Dick made his move. He ascended the last few basement steps, he padded through the empty kitchen and climbed the main stairs to the second floor. And as he did this, Carol heard him, and she walked to her bedroom door right as he arrived in front of her bedroom door. And when Carol opened it up, she was totally startled to see this man she had never seen before standing in her house. But before she could scream, Dick told Carol that he was just here to rob her. He promised that if she did what she was told, she would get through this just fine. And so Carol did as she was told, and she laid down face first on the floor, at which point Dick struck her in the back of the head with that thick rubber hose, knocking her out. He then dragged Carol's unconscious body down the second floor landing, leaving her in front of the bathroom door for a moment. Then Dick looked into the bathroom, and he saw water in the bathtub, just as Norman had told him to expect. But as Dick began dragging Carol into the bathroom, Carol woke up, and immediately she began fighting back. Dick, in a panic, pulled out the Luger to shoot her, but the pistol wouldn't fire, and so he just began bashing the pistol into Carol's face. Blood flowed from Carol's forehead, but she just kept on fighting. Dick hit her again and again, hard enough to break off a piece of the gun's white and black plastic laminate grip. Carol eventually managed to separate herself from her attacker, and she scrambled down the stairs, tumbling into the entryway, and she tried to escape out the front door. But Dick caught up to her right as she was struggling to open up the chain latch, and he continued to bludgeon her over and over again with his now broken gun. Another piece of the handle would break off during this beating downstairs, and 3 live rounds would pop out of the gun. At this point, Dick was totally panicking, and he left Carol on the floor moaning in pain, and he ran into the kitchen. There, he rifled through a door and grabbed a 3-inch paring knife to finish Carol off. Dick descended on Carol in the hallway between the kitchen and front entrance and began stabbing her over and over. On the 50th blow, the knife got stuck in Carol's throat, and when Dick tried to pull it out again, the blade snapped off the handle. At this point, Carol finally stopped moving, and Dick climbed off her, marveling at her will to live. But now it was over, and Dick had things to do before getting out of there as fast as he could. Upstairs in the bathroom, Dick turned on the sink and washed the blood off his shaking hands. He then rushed into the neatly kept master bedroom, pulling out drawers, knocking things over to make it look like this was a robbery gone bad. As Dick bounded down the stairs, he didn't notice that Carol was no longer where he had left her, in the short hallway that led to the kitchen. Dick had no clue that as he was heading out the front door, Carol was stumbling down the block looking for help. Dick left the Highland Park neighborhood and connected with Norman. Nothing in their plan had gone as expected. What was supposed to be a bloodless killing had turned into a gory and violent mess. Together, they disposed of the gun in a swampland north of St. Paul, and then when Norman returned to his home, he picked up the phone to make the hardest call of all. At the other end of the line was the man who had plotted Carol's death from the start and actually put up the money to make it happen. This was the one person Carol had loved and trusted since she first met him 14 years ago at Macalester College. It was Carol's husband, Eugene Cotton Thompson, and he had been planning his wife's murder for almost 2 years. Cotton had been in an on-again, off-again affair for 3 years with a woman named Jackie Olson. He met Jackie when he represented her in a divorce. Cotton handled divorces as well as criminal cases. The attractive young mother didn't have the money to pay him, so Cotton got her a job as a stenographer so she could work it off. She'd go to, quote, business dinners with Cotton and out-of-town trips, while Carol stayed home with the kids. Cotton enjoyed his illicit romance, but Jackie wanted to build a life with him. When Cotton balked at leaving Carol and his kids, Jackie said fine, and she married another man. But when Jackie's new relationship hit the rocks fast, Cotton made another play for her. He promised Jackie that they wouldn't have to worry about Carol anymore, and they'd have plenty of money to live on for the rest of their lives. One of the clients that Cotton represented as a defense attorney was an old classmate from Macalester who had had several scrapes with the law, including being roped into an unrelated murder. This person was Norman Mastrian, and Norman didn't have to plan anything. Cotton had that all figured out. A month before the murder, Cotton got rid of the family dog who barked whenever anything came into the house. Cotton had removed the upstairs phone 2 days before the murder, telling Carol he would swap it out for a phone that fit the house's new color scheme. He planned to call Carol on the morning of the murder, which would ensure that she would go into the kitchen, where the only phone left in the house was located. It was here that Cotton planned for Norman to strike her with the rubber hose and knock her out, and then Norman was supposed to carry an unconscious Carol up the stairs to the bathroom where there would be water left in the tub. Cotton did not typically bathe before work, but on the day of the murder, he would. And he'd leave the stopper in the drain so Norman could fill Carol's lungs with the water. Cotton figured they could make it look like Carol slipped in the tub, hit her head, and then drowned in the bathwater. Knowing that the police would be looking at Cotton as their first suspect, he had had an airtight alibi. He'd be at work making phone calls with his secretary. Cotton planned to finger Big Red for the murder. But Cotton's plan unraveled in a few key places. First, Norman Mastrian, despite whatever crimes he had committed up to that point, he couldn't bring himself to actually kill a church-going mother of 4. So he had subcontracted out the actual killing and did not tell Cotton. Norman gave Dick Anderson the same marching orders Cotton had given him. But Dick wanted more than just a piece of rubber tubing with him when he entered the Thompson house, and so he asked Norman for a backup weapon in the form of a gun. Norman then turned to his 2 robber friends who gave him the customized Luger pistol they'd recently stolen when they burglarized an apartment, and Norman gave it to Dick. Cotton could never have anticipated that pieces of a gun he never planned on using during this attack would then lead police to the hitman, who would then confess everything he knew. police arrested Cotton on June 20th, 1963, 2 months after Carol's murder. In November of 1963, just 8 months after the murder, a jury found Cotton Thompson guilty, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison. As for Norman Mastrian, the middleman for the hit, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, all of which he served, and as for Dick Anderson, the man who actually killed Carol, he would spend almost 2 decades behind bars. On the hot evening of September 20th, 1987, 37-year-old Maria Ferreira hosted a lively family gathering at her small home in Goiânia, Brazil. Goiânia was a cosmopolitan city with nearly 1 million people. Gleaming skyscrapers and tropical fruit trees lined the wealthy downtown area. But there were also areas of extreme poverty. Maria and her husband, Davayer, lived in one of these lower-income neighborhoods where they owned and operated a scrapyard on their property. It was hard work, especially in the intense tropical heat. But Maria and Davayer made a great team. Maria liked to joke that even though Davayer was short and stocky, he always had his head in the clouds. Davayer would tease Maria when she took things too seriously, saying that that was why she had a gray streak in her long brown hair. But on this night, Maria was totally relaxed. There was plenty of delicious food and drink with people she loved, and they were able to pay for it because they had a little extra money from selling more scrap metal than usual. Maria and Davayer had also acquired a rare good luck charm a few days earlier. They never had much in the way of material possessions, but they tried to find beauty in their everyday life. This time, it was in a trinket Davayer had found. As they passed it around the table, she felt grateful for all the good fortune that had come their way. In the chair next to Maria, Davayer scooped a spoonful of black bean and pork stew onto his plate. He was listening to his brother, who was a bus driver, tell a story. He always had something funny to share from one of his routes. Davayer's other brother, Ivo, was there as well with his wife and their 6-year-old daughter, Lei Ji. The little girl's big brown eyes and joyful laugh filled Maria with love. Lei Ji was the closest thing she had had to a daughter since she didn't have any children of her own. It was the perfect night, and that called for a toast. Once everyone refilled their glasses, Maria raised hers in the air and thanked her family for coming. They all cheered and drank to the future. Later, after everyone left, Davayer went into the garage to finish up some work. As Maria washed coffee cups and put away plates, she could hear thunder in the distance. The next morning, on September 21st, Maria woke to the sound of rain pelting her tin rooftop. Goiânia's rainy season normally ran from October to April, but this year it had started earlier than usual. As Maria climbed out of bed, she noticed that she didn't feel well. Her body was stiff and her stomach felt upset. She wrote off her discomfort to the previous night's festivities and tried to carry on with her day. But as time passed, Maria was starting to feel increasingly sick until finally, after a few hours, she started violently vomiting. Now, the pain in Maria's stomach was so bad that she decided she needed to see a doctor right away. She slowly got dressed and walked out to tell Davayer. Maria found him working in the scrapyard. It was cluttered with old refrigerators, large pieces of sheet metal, and disassembled machines. Davayer offered to take her, but she said she didn't want to distract him from his work, so she told him she could get there on her own. Maria took a bus to a nearby hospital and was able to see a doctor right away. After the doctor examined her, he said everything was fine. She must be having an allergic reaction to something she ate. Maria was relieved it wasn't something more serious. She found it hard to believe she could be this sick from food she was used to eating, but the doctor reassured her and said to go home and rest and she would feel better soon. But that evening, Maria still felt just as sick. She called her mom, who lived in a neighboring town, and asked her to come stay for a few days. Maria's mother took a bus there right away, and once she got there, she did her best to nurse her daughter back to health, feeding her broth and herbs, but whatever Maria had caught, it just wasn't going away. Even worse, Maria's mother soon started to feel sick too, with the same symptoms of fever and upset stomach that Maria had. So, 2 days later, Maria's mom had to return back to her home to rest and recuperate as well. Maria was confused. If she was suffering from a food allergy like the doctor thought, why would her mom have gotten sick too? So now she thought maybe she'd come down with the flu and her mother had just caught it from her. So when her brother-in-law, Ivo, stopped by the house on September 24th, Maria tried to keep her distance from him. She'd been sick for 4 days and didn't want to risk passing anything on. Ivo didn't stay long at Maria and Devayere's house, and soon he got back to his own home right in time for lunch. His wife had put out some egg sandwiches, and after Ivo and his wife had sat down to eat, they called in their daughter, Leji, to come join them. But Leji was having too much fun playing with her dolls, her glitter, and her coloring books. Finally, Leji did abandon her toys and took her seat at the table with her parents. But just 10 minutes after eating, Leji threw up. Then, later that afternoon, Ivo and his wife got sick too. At first, they thought it was the eggs they had for lunch, but Ivo soon realized this wasn't just a case of food poisoning. It seemed like almost everyone who had gone to the Ferreira household recently was getting sick. And by now, that included Devayere, who was feeling nauseous, as well as his mother, who had come by to visit. The list grew to include 2 of Devayere's brothers and a handful of their children. The sickness had even spread to several of the neighbors who had visited with Maria and Devayere. 2 of Devayere's scrapyard employees had also become ill, all in the span of a week. When Maria found out about the growing number of people who were getting sick, she was horrified, and she became even more afraid when she noticed something else very disturbing. There were these red lesions that were showing up on her skin that were painful to the touch. By September 27th, nearly a week after first getting sick, Maria's stomach pain was unbearable. As she lay curled up in bed listening to the rain falling outside, she thought back to that last night she felt healthy. It was the same night she had hosted the big family gathering. Maria tried to remember everything she had done that night. Then she realized something. There was only one thing that everyone who had gotten sick over the last 10 days had in common. Maria could barely move, but she knew what she had to do next. If she didn't get to the bottom of this mystery, her whole family could be in serious danger. And so, on the next morning, she willed herself out of bed and slowly managed to get dressed. Then she gathered the evidence she needed in a cloth sack. Maria knew where she wanted to take it, and it wasn't to the hospital where she'd been before. She was going somewhere that had the authority to help her. The only issue was, she needed someone to go with her. She was too exhausted to make the trip on her own. Devayere wasn't feeling well enough to go with her, so she asked another scrapyard employee to accompany her. Maria let the young man carry the bag she'd packed. She was so weak she could barely keep moving. Just down the street, they boarded a crowded bus, and about a half hour later, they got off near an office called the Vigilancia Sanitaria. This was a public health agency that regulated pharmaceuticals, food products, and sanitary conditions. It was basically the Brazilian equivalent of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. Maria thought that if anybody could figure out what was making her and her family so sick, it would be someone at this agency. She and her companion entered the plain brick building through a courtyard and were taken into the office belonging to the agency's director. The young man helping Maria dropped the bag he was carrying on the official's desk. Then Maria wiped her flushed face with a handkerchief and explained what it was. She said the contents of the bag were killing her family. The official just stared at her. He looked inside the bag and seemed confused. The items inside didn't look particularly dangerous. He said what really concerned him was Maria. Maria knew she was sweating and visibly shaking, and she noticed his expression as he looked at all the lesions and burn-like marks on her arms. The official told her that right now, she just needed to see a doctor, but he did promise he would take a closer look at what was in the bag. And, just to be safe, the official put the bag on a chair in the building's courtyard, then made sure Maria knew how to get to the nearest health clinic. Maria was skeptical. The last time she'd seen a doctor, he'd given her the wrong diagnosis, but she didn't know what else to do, so she and her companion left the agency and headed to the bus stop. Maria insisted that her companion return to the scrapyard and get back to work. Unsure and scared about what she would find out, Maria boarded the bus alone. A short time later, a doctor at this clinic carefully examined Maria and then gave her a new diagnosis. He said she was right. She was not experiencing an allergic reaction or food poisoning. What she had was a tropical disease, and her family and friends who were sick probably had it too. He explained that the unusually heavy rains had been spawning mosquitoes and a host of other bugs that carried infectious diseases. A virus like dengue or Zika would explain her symptoms, including the burn-like lesions she'd developed. The doctor assured Maria that this was all very manageable and that everything would be okay. Then he arranged to have her transported to the Tropical Diseases Hospital for specialized treatment. Maria's unease lightened, and she even managed a weak smile. She finally had a real explanation for what was happening to her and her family. It was a relief to think that the bag she had left at the health agency didn't actually have anything to do with a tropical virus. Less than an hour later, Maria arrived at the Tropical Diseases Hospital. As a doctor took her vitals, she asked if he knew what type of virus was going around. But instead of answering her question, the doctor gently took her arm and began closely examining her skin lesions. Then he called one of the nurses over to look at them. The nurse said she'd seen some other patients with similar burns in the last few days. Suddenly, the doctor's face turned serious, which made Maria extremely nervous. He continued to examine her, and then he stepped back. He explained that the doctor at the previous health clinic had been wrong too. Maria's symptoms did not line up with any kind of tropical disease he'd ever treated. In fact, this doctor was afraid Maria's symptoms were connected to another sickness entirely, and if he was even partially correct, they would need to move quickly. This could be a dangerous situation. The doctor asked her detailed questions about the past several days, and Maria shared everything she could remember. She could see the alarm spread across his face the more they talked. Maria felt a terrible wave of panic and nausea start to wash over her, and then she felt like she needed to tell him about the bag. So she explained that she had brought this bag and left it at the public health agency in hopes that they would analyze it. As soon as she said this, the doctor quickly excused himself and ran as fast as he could to the phone. He called a physician at the state's Department of the Environment. He tried to hide the rising panic in his voice as he explained the urgency of the situation and that action needed to be taken immediately. Both doctors agreed that the bag Maria brought to the public health office had to be examined as soon as possible to prevent the spread of what was making everyone sick. The doctor at the Department of the Environment knew a specialist named Walter Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, who had no relation to Maria and her family, would be able to properly analyze the bag's contents. But because it was late in the evening, they wouldn't be able to contact him until the next day. Early the next morning, Dr. Ferreira was getting dressed when his phone rang. It was the doctor from the Department of the Environment calling. Dr. Ferreira paced anxiously as he learned what was going on. There was a huge crisis taking place in Goiânia, and he needed to act quickly. He scribbled down the address to the public health office where the bag was, and then ran out the door and went to a nearby office to grab some equipment. He hoped his colleague at the Department of the Environment was wrong about everything, because if he wasn't, that meant thousands of lives were now in danger. About an hour later, Dr. Ferreira arrived at the public health office. Before he entered the courtyard, he pulled a device out of a case. The device would reveal if their terrible suspicions were correct. He carefully switched on the piece of equipment, but right away it seemed like the device was malfunctioning. And no matter how much Dr. Ferreira struggled to adjust the equipment, it just wouldn't work. The readings were just so impossible that he assumed it had to be broken. Dr. Ferreira was frustrated. Now he would need to go back to his office and swap out this broken device for a new one. So he let the receptionist know he'd be back as soon as possible. Almost 2 hours later, Dr. Ferreira returned with a replacement piece of equipment. When he turned that one on, the exact same thing happened. The readings were impossible. He tried turning it on and off several times, but he just kept getting these totally incredible readings. After a few minutes, Dr. Ferreira was horrified to realize that he had been wrong. Both of these devices had been working perfectly fine, and that meant the reality of this situation was much, much worse. If this situation didn't get handled, the whole city of Goiânia could have a catastrophic health crisis on their hands, and maybe all of Brazil could have a health crisis on their hands. So Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to get to that bag. Dr. Ferreira ran inside the building and was met by the facility's director. Ferreira asked where this bag was, but the director explained that he had become concerned about the bag's contents, so he had called in the fire brigade for assistance. In fact, the firefighters were already there and were about to take the bag from the building's courtyard. Their plan was to dispose of it in a nearby stream. Dr. Ferreira ran into the courtyard and saw a group of firefighters surrounding the bag. He yelled for them to stop, and that if they threw it in the water, it would trigger a horrific disaster. He warned them not to touch it and insisted that everyone just evacuate the building. Once Dr. Ferreira was able to explain what was happening, the firefighters realized just how serious this situation was, and they helped him clear the area. But the day was far from over. Dr. Ferreira knew he needed to track down Maria and speak to her about the contents of this bag. He located her at a hospital, but her condition had now worsened to the point where she was just too weak to even talk. But she was able to instruct Dr. Ferreira to just go to her family's junkyard, where he would find her husband, and he could answer any questions the doctor might have. It was noon by the time Dr. Ferreira and his colleague got to Maria and Devaier's scrapyard. When they arrived, they saw Devaier working next to his garage. Dr. Ferreira introduced himself and tried to shake Devaier's hand, but Devaier politely refused, and then he showed them the inside of his hand, and there was this huge open sore on his palm. Dr. Ferreira looked at it and then immediately shot a look of worry at his colleague. The doctor knew this type of wound on Devaier's hand could only be caused by one thing, and it was the thing that Dr. Ferreira feared the most. Devaier told them that this whole situation began 11 days earlier on September 18th. That morning, around 10 a.m., a young man had stopped by their scrapyard and told him about some scrap metal he'd found and wanted to sell. He had never seen anything like it and thought it was valuable. Devaier said he was interested and told the young man to bring it over. Later that day, the young man returned, now hauling something in a wheelbarrow. Inside this wheelbarrow were the disassembled pieces of a large metal contraption. There was also a small capsule shaped like an oversized thermos. Devaier thought both items were made of stainless steel, which would earn him a nice profit. But after Devaier examined the capsule more closely, he became even more excited. It was lined with lead, which was an even more valuable metal. Devaier paid the man the equivalent of about $30 and brought his new purchases into his garage. He left them there before heading inside to eat dinner. Once he was done eating, he headed back to the garage to start extracting the lead. But when Devaier opened back up the garage doors, he was amazed by what he now saw inside. A strange blue glow was now coming from the thermos-shaped capsule. Devaier was a deeply spiritual man and thought he might have encountered something supernatural. He grabbed the metal capsule and called Maria into the garage so she could see it too. When Maria saw its unusual glow, she was just as mystified as Devaier. They took a closer look and saw that the blue light was coming through a small window on the side of the capsule. The window looked like it had already been punctured with a screwdriver, probably by the young man who had just sold it to Devaier. Maria thought there could be a priceless gemstone hidden inside, but Devaier was sure that it was actually a holy relic that would bring blessings and good fortune to the family. Devaier was determined to continue examining this object. So he poked around the small opening with a screwdriver and removed what appeared to be several small pellets of a glittery bluish powder. The pellets were part of a slightly bigger pile that still sat deep inside the capsule. For all de Valliere knew, this luminous powder could be worth thousands of dollars. It could change their lives in a way they'd never imagined. As de Valliere told the doctors of this discovery, he remembered how special he felt handling the powder, and he wanted his whole family to experience it. This was the good luck charm they shared at their big family dinner. Over the next few days, de Valliere shared his discovery with more family and friends and neighbors, and each time someone came over, he brought out the special glitter. Small groups of people gathered around the capsule and peered through the broken window to admire the glowing powder inside. Many touched the small pellets de Valliere had extracted. Seeing how excited everyone was about the powder made de Valliere determined to extract the rest of it from the capsule. So a friend came over and, using a screwdriver, helped him remove fragments from behind the glass window. Eventually, they did get it all out. The entire pile was small enough to fit in the palm of de Valliere's hand. Once all the powder had been extracted, de Valliere gave the capsule to 2 of his employees and asked them to melt it down for metal and sell it to a nearby scrapyard. Then he brought some of the powder to Maria, who in turn dusted it all over her pajamas and bed sheets. De Valliere gave a grain-sized fragment to his brother, the bus driver, who rubbed it on his hands before heading into work. And on his shift as a bus driver, he came into contact with dozens of people. Another one of de Valliere's brothers dipped his finger in the blue powder and traced a cross on his abdomen for divine protection. Maria's mother handled some of the powder while she was taking care of Maria, and then she too became ill. Around that same time, de Valliere had given some fragments to his brother Ivo, and later, Ivo's daughter, Leiji, played with the glittery crystals and rubbed them all over her hands and arms. And then immediately after doing that, she had eaten her egg sandwich and become ill right away. De Valliere also shared his good luck charm with several neighbors who began having symptoms as well. After Maria had spent days wondering what might have caused so many people to get sick so quickly, she finally realized they all had one thing in common. They all had come in contact with this mysterious blue powder. So, on the morning of September 28th, 10 days after buying this capsule, Maria told de Valliere she was taking what was left of the powder and the capsule to the local health agency to be analyzed. She placed these remnants in a large cloth bag, then she headed out with one of de Valliere's employees to retrieve the parts of the capsule that had been sold to the other scrapyards. She managed to collect most of it. Those were also placed in the bag that Maria brought to the public health office. The story confirmed Dr. Ferreira's worst fears. He asked de Valliere about the young man who first sold him the capsule and where he'd gotten it. De Valliere said he wasn't sure, but he thought it might have come from some sort of abandoned facility that was located nearby. Dr. Ferreira turned to his colleague and saw that the other doctor's face had now gone white, because he knew exactly where that capsule had come from. It was a clinic that had closed 2 years earlier, a cancer treatment clinic. The capsule had come from a radiation therapy machine, and the magical blue powder that was inside wasn't from a precious gemstone. The powder was a highly radioactive material called cesium-137. When properly contained in the capsule, the powder's destructive capabilities could be used for focused cancer treatments. But without that protective shell, the powder became one of the most lethal substances on Earth. Maria and the others were not suffering from a tropical disease or any of the other things that doctors first thought. They were experiencing massive radiation poisoning, and the lesions they had developed were radiation burns. The handful of powder that de Valliere found was enough to make more than 200 people extremely ill and place thousands more in danger. Dr. Ferreira knew all this because he was a medical physicist, and the tool he had tried to use outside of the public health agency was a radiation detector. He thought both detectors were broken because they were making so much noise and their readings were so high they were literally off the charts. But the detectors were correct. They were reading such high levels of radiation in the vicinity of where this bag was that contained the powder that the federal government would have to get involved. And now that Dr. Ferreira had confirmed just how serious the situation had become, he contacted Brazil's Nuclear Energy Commission. Within a matter of hours, they started testing thousands of Goiânia's residents for radiation poisoning in the city's sports stadium. On the morning of September 30th, 13 days after Devayer bought the capsule, workers in hazmat suits arrived in the courtyard of the health agency to properly dispose of the bag that contained the radioactive material. The abandoned cancer clinic, where the blue powder was first discovered, was demolished as well. On October 23rd, Maria Ferreira finally died. Her niece, Leiji, also died on the same day. They were each buried in special fiberglass, lead-lined coffins to prevent radiation from leaking out. By the end of the month, Devayer's 2 young employees also died as a result of the exposure they'd received when they melted down the capsule for Devayer. While Maria's husband, Devayer, survived the tragedy, he never mentally recovered. Devayer died in 1994, 7 years later. Thankfully, no one else died from the radiation exposure, but many others sustained amputations, severe burn scars, and lifelong medical conditions. The Goiânia incident remains one of history's deadliest disasters involving medical radiation. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, hosted by me, Mr. Ballen. A quick reminder, the content in this episode is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This episode was written by Lauren DeLille. Our editor is Heather Dundas. Sound design is by Matthew Chilelli. Coordinating producer is Sophia Martins. Our senior producer is Alex Benedon. Our associate producers and researchers are Sarah Vitak and Natalie Bettendorf. Fact-checking was done by Sheila Patterson. For Ballen Studios, our producer is Alyssa Tomaneng. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Executive producers are myself, Mr. Ballen, and Nick Witters. For Wondery, senior managing producer is Ryan Lohr. Our head of sound is Marcelino Villapando. Our producer is Julie Magruder. Senior producers are Laura Donna Polivoda, Dave Schiller,